It was interesting because I had a conversation with Doug Soderstrom when I was getting a screen for my front door fixed, and we were talking a little history, and he said, yeah, I watched this thing on Charles Manson the other day. It was unbelievable. Well, it's the one that I'm going to show you, in the words of Linda Kasabian. So anyway, he was paying attention to it. So let's talk about Leslie Van Houten. She was the youngest. She was only 19 years old at the time of the murders. Not much older than you guys are. If you can imagine, girls, that you get yourself involved with this Charles Manson, you're murdering people at the age you're at now. That's where she was. She was only at the La Bianca murder. She was not at the Tate residence. Only the La Bianca residence. And she was born into a middle-class family in California. Classmates, when interviewed, said she was very outgoing, very athletic in her youth. Pretty normal family, middle-class family in California. But what happens sometimes with kids that causes some issues is when she was 14 years old, her parents divorced. And she began experimenting with marijuana and LSD throughout high school. So the divorce definitely affected her well-being. And she began experimenting with marijuana and LSD in high school, and she actually ran away from home, dropped out of school, and guess where she ended up?
No, Haight-Ashbury.
Haight-Ashbury, okay? She ends up in Haight-Ashbury. Didn't even let you answer, right? And in the summer of 1968, she meets Charles Manson at Haight-Ashbury, and she ends up joining the Manson family at Swan Ranch. So she again, folks divorced, she goes down the wrong path, begins experimenting with marijuana and LSD. She runs away from home, drops out of school, lands in the Haight-Ashbury area, and in the summer of 1968 she met Charles Manson and then joined the Manson family at the Swan Ranch.
How old was she when she was?
Not probably 17 or so, I'm not sure. She is 69 years old now, and she was recommended for parole at her 22nd hearing on January 30th, 2019. I want to repeat that so you get it. She's 69 years old and was recommended for parole at her 22nd parole hearing last January 30th, 2019. Now, I don't know if you know anything about a parole board, but they recommended on her 22nd trip to her parole hearing, they recommended that she be paroled, let out. Now, according to the state of California, the governor of California has the final say of yes or no once a parolee has been paroled. And that governor has 150 days to decide that. So January 30th to February 30th is 30 days. To March 30th is 90 days. To April 30th or 60, what are we at? 90, it's like 90 days now, right? What's today? 23rd. So we're not quite to 90 days. So by the time you graduate from high school or early summer, you're going to hear whether Leslie Van Houten is paroled or not. Because it's right history right now. She was given the okay in January, but the governor has 150 days to decide yes or no, and he hasn't decided. I don't know. Be interesting. It'll be political
Well,
for
she
sure.
was really young at the
Yeah.
time.
I don't know.
What will happen if she does? Like, where will she go? Does she have family that's alive?
You know, that's who knows. I mean, who knows?
Literally letting her out would probably be worse than...
Well, think about it. If you think about, you spent 50 years of your life in prison. All you know is prison. Do you think of that? Anybody seen the Shawshank Redemption? You ever seen that movie, Shawshank Redemption? Are you serious? That is a wonderful movie about a guy that got, and part of the story is a guy that got paroled after spending his whole life in prison, ended up hanging himself because he could not deal with society because that was all he knew for 50 years.
Well, society's a lot different than
It
she
is
was
different.
in it.
So it'll be interesting to see. If I had to bet $100 either way, I would probably bet that they go ahead and let her out. But I think it'll depend on how much pressure they get from the Tate family. Although she didn't murder anybody at the Tate residence, and the LaBiancas are kind of long gone. Sharon Tate's sister has always been the one that attended these parole hearings and you know, try to make a difference. So that'll be interesting to see how that goes, but it'll be history. I expect you, when you hear the news, I expect a few text messages saying, hey, Mr. Durr, did you hear the news? So keep your ears out. Could happen any day, but they have up to 150. So let me get my math. So January, February, March, April, May. Actually, it'd have to happen sometime in June, would it not? That's the deadline. So yeah, maybe it will. Who
My
knows?
child's first birthday.
Okay, well, we'll see how that goes.
70 or 61st birthday?
Will be June 26th, yeah. Maybe it'll come on my birthday. Wouldn't that be his story? All right, let's talk about Linda Kasabian. Kind of an interesting story on Linda Kasabian, a little bit longer. Linda Kasabian. Remember what she did, Emily Baumstark? What did Linda Kasabian do to avoid going to prison?
She snitched.
Emily? Did you not pick these notes up?
I have school at my house. I didn't look at all these videos.
Anyway, she turned state's evidence, and she had a trial. I'll tell you a little bit about that. Now remember, she and Barbara Hoyt testified against the family, which led to their guilty. Okay? She was 20 years old at the time of the murders, and she was present at both murders. However, she never went in either residence. She was kind of the lookout, so to speak, in the car. So she stayed in the car and never went into either residence. So she would probably be the best one to make a deal with, right? Because if you try to make a deal with an absolute murderer, someone that stabbed and carved into people's flesh, public relation-wise, that doesn't look very good. So when they made the deal, they found the one that was probably less guilty, and she never was involved in either murder site other than she was there as a lookout. She was an accessory, so to speak. Now, she was born in Maine, and she moved to Los Angeles in 1968 with a husband and an infant daughter. So her circumstances are just kind of a little bit different than these other ones and how she got tied into the Manson family. So she was born in Maine, and her husband and their infant daughter moved to Los Angeles in 1968. Well, she was pregnant when they moved from Maine to Los Angeles. So she had an infant daughter and was pregnant again. And she met a female family member by the name of Catherine Scher. And she met her in Los Angeles. So when they moved to Los Angeles in 1968, Kasabian, who was pregnant again, met a female member of the Manson family by the name of Catherine Scher. She was known to the family as Gypsy. That's what she went by, was Gypsy. So when you see the video on Linda Kasabian that we're going to see, Gypsy will be the name given, okay? Now, Kasabian was having serious marital problems at the time. And Gypsy convinced Linda that if she moved to the Spahn Ranch with her daughter, she'd be much better off than living with a husband she didn't love. And she convinced her into doing that. That's how she ended up there. So I'm sure that Gypsy painted this as a better picture than it really was. And she didn't really care much for her husband. And so she was convinced by Gypsy or Catherine Scher that if you moved to the Spahn Ranch and became part of the family, you would have a much better life than living with this husband that you didn't love. So she agrees, but she's kind of a little bit bright. She decides to go herself to the ranch and check it out. She doesn't make a rash decision. She's kind of going to check it out before she decides. So Gypsy gives her a ride to the Spahn Ranch, and poor old Linda Kasabian gets smitten with Charles Tex Watson. She sees him and she gets smitten with him, and she slept with him the first night she was there and fell in love. So she was pretty vulnerable, didn't like her husband much. Became smitten with Tex Watson. Spent the night at the Spahn Ranch, and the rest is self-explanatory.
Did you like it back?
Well, we'll see if you tell me. Well, after their rendezvous, Kasabian tells Watson about a $5,000 inheritance that her husband's friend had back at the trailer they were living in. So Kasabian has this rendezvous with Tex Watson and she spills the beans that, hey, my husband's friend inherited $5,000 and it's in cash and it's back at my trailer. Okay, hey, Mr. Sanford.
I'm sorry to interrupt, can I borrow you for
You
just a
betcha.
second? I have a question for you.
So try to guess what, Mr. Sanford, what Charles Tex Watson thinks about that $5,000.
Nab and grab. They go and murder everyone.
Oh, Watson convinced her to steal the money and give it to Charles Manson and the family. Oh, her and Gypsy took the money, and she gave the money to Charles Manson. The first time she met him.
Sorry to interrupt,
No, you're fine.
maybe you got confused.
No, well, he did. He did.
No, this is intentional.
So anyway, she tells about this $5,000 that her husband's friend has back at the trailer. Well, Watson convinces her to go steal the money and give it to the Manson family. Give it to specifically Charles Manson. So he convinces her to go and get that money out of the trailer and give it to Charles Manson for the family. Well, she's feeling pretty accepted there at the Spawn Ranch, so Kasabian has Gypsy drive her back to the trailer where she takes the money. Takes the $5,000 in cash out of the trailer. And the first time she ever met Charles Manson is when she gave him the money. Okay? So Charles Tex Watson takes advantage of the situation, hears about the $5,000, convinces her to go back and get it and give it to Charles Manson, the family. And the first time that she meets Manson, she gives the money to him. Well, you can imagine Linda's husband arrives at the ranch with the man that the money belongs to, and he's demanding that it's given back. Okay? So he doesn't know anything about this Manson family or this craziness going on at the Spawn Ranch. He just knows that his wife's out there, sleeping with one of the guys out there, and I don't think he cared much about getting his wife back, but he sure as heck wanted this buddy's $5,000.
He didn't care about his kids either?
I don't think he did, no. I think it was a tough deal. I can't speak for that, I shouldn't say, but I know that he arrived at the ranch with the man to whom the money belonged and demanded it be returned. Well, first person he met was Charles Manson, and you can imagine, after having a visit with Charles Manson, who was very, very violent person, very intimidating, both the men left without any money. Okay?
What did he tell him?
I don't know for sure. We'll wait for the video. Okay? Now, as I mentioned, Kasabian was sent to both murder sites but never participated in either crime. This is kind of interesting. She actually stayed behind the house of the Tate residence as the lookout, got out of the car and stayed behind the house, and she listened to the screams from the murders and actually came face to face with Wojtek Frykowski as he staggered out of the Tate house to the lawn where Watson finished killing him. So she is actually standing behind the house of the Tate residence. She's hearing all this screaming going on. She comes face to face with Wojtek Frykowski, who has been injured and is staggering out on the lawn, and watches Charles Tex Watson finish him off.
How come you just listen to that?
She also witnessed Susan Atkins killing Abigail Folger, who was also found where? Remember? Outside on the lawn. So they were trying to escape, and she also witnessed Susan Atkins killing Abigail Folger as she struggled to escape outside the house as well. Now, do you remember I told you at the La Bianca murders that Charles Manson went in and tied up the two and then left? The person he left with and drove off with was Linda Kasabian. So she was there, she stayed in the car, he went in and tied him up, gave orders to the others. Remember, how'd the others get home? You remember after they showered and ate out of their refrigerator? They hitchhiked. So he drove off from the La Bianca residence, he being Manson, with Kasabian.
They didn't think they were going to get caught,
Who's that?
or did they care?
You know, I'm not sure. I don't know. What would you think there? They probably wouldn't have gotten caught if Susan Atkins isn't flapping her jaws in jail. When you think about it, they might have got away with this, okay? Well, at 1 a.m. the next morning, after the LaBianca murders, at 1 o'clock the next morning, Manson took Kasabian to an apartment of a musician and ordered her to knock on his door. So at 1 o'clock in the morning, the next morning, Manson took Kasabian to an apartment of a musician, and Manson ordered Kasabian to knock on the door. And she was instructed that when he answered, she was to slit his throat. And where did Manson go? Left. So 1 o'clock the next morning after the LaBianca murders, Charles Manson takes Linda Kasabian to an apartment of a musician, drops her off, tells her to knock on the door, and if the guy answers the door, she's supposed to slit the guy's throat. Well, she purposely knocked on the wrong door so she would not find the man she was supposed to kill. She didn't want to do it, so she knocked on the wrong door.
And slit that guy's throat?
No. Now, she was escorted by a male family member who was supposed to watch her get the job done when Manson left. But she convinced this male family member, I don't want to commit this, let's not do this, and he agreed, okay? So he wasn't, not everybody was crazy, you know what I mean? Because, you know, Barbara Hoyt wasn't crazy, and Linda Kasabian wasn't crazy, and whoever this male family member that chose not to commit the murders or make sure she committed this slicing of the throat, so he convinces her. Historians will tell you that she was the only family member involved, so to speak, that was bothered by the murders, and she's the only one that showed any remorse. Now this is interesting. How'd she get herself out of the situation?
She snitches.
Well, she did that, but on August 13th of 1969, Manson directed her to go see a fellow by the name of Bobby Bugalosi. So on,
Wait, didn't Manson find out that she didn't kill him though? The guy that she was supposed to kill?
and I don't know what excuse she gave. We'll see the video. We'll go from there. So finally, on August 13th, 1969, Charles Manson directs Linda Kasabian to go see a fellow by the name of Bobby Bugalosi. Now, Bugalosi was in prison. You know what he's in prison for? Killing Gary Hinman. Remember when Susan Atkins and a male family member went and killed Gary Hinman? Manson went and sliced him with a sword, wanted to borrow money, and he told him no. And then remember Susan Atkins and this male family member killed him because she was in jail for suspicion of murder along with prostitution, Susan Atkins. Well, the guy that murdered Gary Hillman was a guy by the name of Bobby Bugalosi. And he was in prison for that. And on August 13th of 1969, Manson had directed her to go see him. Now, what did she see it as an opportunity to do? Get out of the Spawn Ranch forever and free herself from Manson's family. She went to get her children. Remember, she had two now because one was born there. She went to get her children, but she couldn't gain access to them without bringing suspicion to her plan to escape the family. So she had to make the choice to leave her children there. Oh yeah.
No.
Yeah.
Oh no.
She told Manson she was leaving to go see Bugalosi and took a car and never returned. So when he told her to go there, she went back to try to get her children because she wanted out of the situation. Had no way of getting her children. Took the car and told Charles Manson that she was going to go see Bobby Bugalosi and never returned. They were at the ranch. Yeah.
So she was just gonna let them be raised in that stupid.
Well, she did. What would you? I mean, put yourself in a position.
you
were
get
there
your
for.
kid.
You were there for 2 murders. Your lone life. I mean, that's what she chose. Where'd she go? She went to New Mexico and went into hiding. So after she left, she fled into New Mexico and went into hiding. Okay, now, Don't panic yet, sweetie. Well, after the family had been arrested for the murders, the children, all of them, including hers, were taken into state custody. Okay? When they found out who they belonged to, and Kasabian was trying to find out where they were because she was as concerned almost as Aurora on this deal, which I get your point. She traveled to Los Angeles after the rest were arrested, got her children, and went back into hiding. So this was kind of a traumatic time for her. Well, did she get arrested? Did they even know she was involved at this point when you think about it? No. So a few months after the murders, she turned herself in to authorities and then became the lead witness for the prosecution. So that's a crazy story, but that's what happened to Linda Kasabian. Okay, so a few months after the murders, she turned herself into authorities and eventually became the lead witness. Her plea bargain and testimony allowed her to avoid prison. They made a deal with her. If you testify in these murders, you will not have to go to prison. They didn't do anything to her, I mean, legally. So after the trial's over, she doesn't want to be in California, obvious probably, so she moved to New Hampshire, where she lived with her mother and her children. She got as far away order as she could. I can't blame her. Her mother just happened to live in New Hampshire, so she moved all the way to New Hampshire to live with her mother and her children.
What about her ex-husband? Never.
Because of the constant media and public attention, what do you think she did? Changed her name. So she goes to New Hampshire, lives with her mother and her children. Because of the constant media and public attention, she changes her name. Well, she can't live with her mother forever, so she eventually moves back to